My brothers and sisters, we are, I suppose, midway through our consideration of the first woe trumpet of chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. The fifth angel obviously blowing the fifth trumpet, but as we have shown before, it was the first of the woe trumpets, which obviously had to do basically with the Eastern Roman Empire as distinguished from the Western, which we've already considered in chapter 8. Last time we saw through chapter 9 the development in the signs and symbols which are presented therein, the uprise of the power of the Mohammedans through the great prophet of their religion, Muhammad himself, and we saw of the way that he was to flee from Mecca to Medina, and the writing of the Quran, which obviously was about the same time, and the establishment of the Muslims as a very political as well as a religious force. And we've come in our considerations, and obviously for those who weren't here, we can only ask you to get the tape. I don't propose to retract on the verses. We've got to the point where we were considering in verse 3 that there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And Charles, for those who were here, you recall, did bring us, I hasten to add, a dead locust, which gave us the indication of what they were like. And we read various books upon the subject to show what an apt description the locusts were of the uprise of the Arab power under the religion of Mohammed. And then in verse 4, it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And again we considered, by way of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that it was an actual decree of one of the caliphs who was to succeed Muhammad as the head of the Muslim power, that this, what we find in verse 4, was an actual decree by this caliph that they were told to leave apart certain things and certain people apart from those who had not the seal of God in their foreheads. And it was quite remarkable, as we saw last time, how almost the very phrases used in verse 4 were part of the speech of this caliph when he commanded his soldiers as they prepared to go into battle. We saw also that the very attitude of the Arab power, the Muslim power, was directed against the eastern bloc of the Roman Empire, but particularly in the first instance against the Middle East section. And so we come to verse 5, that to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And that in verse 5, the idea of the 5 months, we read again later on in the same chapter, when you will notice when we come to verse 10, they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. So we want to consider the 2 5 months period together. And so we're going to leave it over from verse 5 until we come to verse 10, and we'll look at the two in parallel together. And so therefore, in verse 6, we come to the idea that in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. So if we can commence tonight's studies with consideration, therefore, of that verse 6, by taking you back to the prophet Jeremiah. And we want to go back to the 8th chapter of the prophecy of Jeremiah. Now you notice the phraseology which is used here. Verse 1. At that time, saith Yahweh, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of his princes, and the bones of the priests, and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, out of their graves. And they shall spread them before the sun and the moon and all the hosts of heaven, whom they have loved and whom they have served, and after whom they have walked, and whom they have sought, and whom they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered, nor be buried. They shall be for dung upon the face of the earth. And death shall be chosen rather than life, by all the residue of them that remain of this evil family, which remain in all the places whither I have driven them, saith Yahweh of hosts. And that was obviously a description of the terrible calamities which were to fall the Jewish people. And the indication there is death would be chosen rather than life. And again, this is all based upon what we read in the book of Deuteronomy and the 30th chapter of that book. Because this which we read there was spoken of by Moses many years before. Sorry, it's the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. The 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. And you'll immediately pick up the context of Deuteronomy 28. Verse 63. It shall come to pass that as Yahweh rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so Yahweh will rejoice over you to destroy you, to bring you to naught, and ye shall be plucked off from the land whither thou goest to possess it. And Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people from the one end of the earth even to the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but Yahweh shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were evening. And at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart, wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. And again Moses, obviously under the hand of God, was prophesying of the terrible things which would befall the Jewish people. And of course the atrocities can be brought up to date as we saw them through the Hitler regime of Nazi Germany in the last war. Their life literally hung in doubt. And they would pray, would God it were evening in the morning, and in the evening, would God it were morning. They would choose death rather than life because of the terrible punishments and the incredible agonies which they were caused to suffer. And so in that 8th chapter of Jeremiah, the same idea. Death shall be chosen rather than life. And you have to be in extreme pain or extreme torment or extreme punishment to obviously choose death rather than life. But that was what God predicted of his own people because of the things that he would punish them with because of their iniquities. Now, although obviously it's not referring to the Jewish people, as we come back to the Apocalypse in chapter 9, the same idea is brought before us in that verse 6, where we've got, in those days, men shall seek death and shall find it, and shall desire to die, but death shall flee from them. Now, obviously, this is not speaking in the Apocalypse in a literal sense. But it does go to emphasize, as we've seen back in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah, the terrible anguish and pressure, whoever it's been referred to, were under, to desire death rather than life. Now, how did this come about, and why, just following simple logic, if they wanted to die, why couldn't they just die? Why should it say, men shall seek death and shall not find it? Well, the answer is, of course, that we're not talking in the literal, simple sense. We're talking in the apocalyptic sign and symbol sense. Now what's been happening, and again apologies for those who haven't followed the progress of Mohammed and the Muslim power, but what's been happening is, of course, territory by territory, nation by nation, spreading out from Medina, where it all began. The power of the Muslims, the power of the Arabs, has gradually increased and caused considerable pain to the Eastern Roman Empire. Initially, as we saw, it was not going to affect Constantinople itself, where the actual seat of power was. If you remember, we saw that delegations had been sent by the Muslims to Constantinople, and they were treated with utter contempt. There was no way that the power of the East felt that the Muslims could ever be more than a pain in the side of the Eastern Roman Empire. They never thought they would gain sufficient momentum and power and strength to have any effect upon the Eastern Roman Empire at all. But of course, as the years went on, this became more and more obvious to the power of Constantinople, that the Muslims were gaining bit by bit, territory by territory, power by power, all the time. And we've come to the point, as we're going to reflect back in the history later on this evening, we've come to the point now, in verse 6, that in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it. It became increasingly obvious to the people of the East, to the people of the rulers of Constantinople, that the uprise of the Muslim power, of the Saracen power, was increasing to such a degree that they couldn't withstand it. And therefore, they were basically willing almost to seek death, not in the sense that they wanted physically to die, but in the sense of politically, they were willing to surrender their power to this growing force of Mohammedanism. But they didn't find it. And there was one good reason they didn't find it. And it's basically the same principle when we go back to the time between the Old and the New Testament. And again, I'm taking you back in thought, not because it's equating to the same time period or referring to the same powers, but the principle which happened during the Testaments is exactly the same principle we're now going to see under the first woe trumpet. You will recall Edom as a power in the Old Testament scriptures. And you know that the Edomites had many conflicts with the nation of Israel. You will know also that Edom rejoiced when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came and destroyed Jerusalem and the people of Judah. You will notice and remember also that Obadiah speaks of God's indignation against Edom because they rejoiced in the day of Judah's calamity. And it was Nebuchadnezzar who was sent, obviously, unbeknownst to him, but providentially we know it to be a fact. Nebuchadnezzar was sent by God to punish Edom. But that was only a temporary matter. And Edom remained as a force, both politically and nationally, until that period between the Testaments. And of course, from the days of Malachi to the days of Matthew, we have the uprise of the power which we have come to know through history of the Maccabees, and in particular one Judas Maccabee. And of course he was very zealous for the things relating to Judaism. And it was he and his army who conquered the power of Edom. And he gave them a choice. They could either convert to Judaism or they could die. They had that simple choice. They either accepted Judaism or they were put to death with the sword. And so Edom ceased to be a nation at all. And the remembrance of Edom, obviously, was destroyed at that time, as the prophets had foretold. Now again, that same principle is taken forward in the prophets in something which we've looked at many times before. And we think of the arrival of Jesus Christ upon the earth and his declaration before the world to fear God and give glory to him. And we know that it will be the judgments which the Master will pour out upon this earth which will eventually cause the nation to understand the principles of righteousness. But the prophet has told us that the kingdom and nation that will not serve shall perish. So likewise, the nations in the earth at the time of the Master's return have likewise got a choice. They either accept him as king of the world, they either accept the saints as governors of the world, they either accept the religion which will go forth from Zion as being theirs, or they will die. It's as straightforward and simple as that. Now those principles are brought to bear here in chapter 9. The power of the East felt they'd got a choice. And the choice basically, through the power of the people, I suppose is the right phrase, who were putting pressure upon the rulers, they didn't want the problems which the uprising of Mohammed and the Saracens had caused them. And therefore they were quite happy and willing to surrender the territory and the power to the Arabs. But there was one condition. They had got to convert to Mohammedanism. That the Arabs didn't just accept, they would be ruled over by them. There was no such thing as far as the Mohammedan power was concerned as conscientious objection. And therefore nobody, and don't forget we're talking basically of Catholic people, because of course although they were in the East, they were very much dominated still by the Bishop of Rome, as we shall see as we go through the Apocalypse in chapter 12 and 13. And of course, as we saw last time again, the Muslim power was so opposed to the Catholic power on that one proviso that the one believed in one God and the other believed in a trinity of gods. And of course it was the Muslim power, although they believed in Allah as the one God and not the one true God as we understand it, but nevertheless it was a religion based upon one God, which was diametrically opposed to the religion of the East, the religion of the Catholics, which believed in Trinitarianism. And therefore there was no way that the Eastern Bloc were prepared to convert themselves to Mohammedanism. And although they would seek political death, they didn't find it. They felt the price was too high to pay, and therefore they resisted the uprise from Mohammed. And therefore in verse 6, they shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. Although it may have been more advantageous in many ways for them to accept the yoke which the Saracens would put upon them, they weren't prepared to accept the price of turning to the religion of their foes. And therefore, verse 6 was a very apt description of the history which is given to us concerning the events of that day. It was a question, not that the Arabs necessarily wanted to destroy the power of the East. It was rather the other way round, as verse 6 indicates, that Constantinople was willing to come under the bondage of the Arabs, but not at the price of turning to Mohammedanism. And therefore there was a conflict and there was an uprise. I'm not medical. Perhaps the medical expert on my left will tell us. But the indication of verse 6, so authorities say, is just the impression also of the feeling one gets when you've been bitten by a scorpion. The feeling that you almost feel like dying, but it's not quite fatal. You would think that'd be fair comment. That is generally what the authorities would have us believe. As we, again, I'm sorry for those who were not here, we discussed the bite of the scorpion or the sting of the scorpion. Although very, very painful, it's not actually fatal to the human body. And therefore, generally it is accepted in verse 6, although we're talking here on a political wavelength. Nevertheless, the feeling of those who have been bitten by the scorpion are those who would like to die, but obviously can't quite die. It's like, when you've had flu, you feel awful. But obviously with a scorpion bite, it's that much more deadly, but you don't actually die. So that's verse 6, which obviously is the progression onwards in the development of the uprise of the power from the east. But you notice how it describes them now in verse 7 and verse 8. The shapes of the locusts were like unto horses. Now don't forget, again, going back to verse 3, we have seen that the locusts were an apt description of the Arabs under the banner of the Muslim faith. And now in verse 7, as we saw the locusts as they obviously parade across the ground, were a very apt description of the armies of the Saracens, and we went back to Joel 1 and other places where locusts have been used before by God to describe armies. So now these locusts are described for us in verse 7. The shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold. And their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women. And their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplate, as it were, breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions. And there were stings in their tails. So as John was being shown the vision of this army of the Saracens as it was going into battle and destroying as it went, he describes it in the way that we have just read in verses 7, 8 and 9. We've already established beyond reasonable doubt that the locusts were a superb description of these Arabs. And yet verse 7 says, they were like unto horses prepared unto the battle. Now if you go back to Joel chapter 2, Joel chapter 2, well of course Joel has already used the description of the locusts to describe the uprise of the power of Babylon. We find in verse 4 of Joel 2, the appearance of them is the appearance of horses, and as horsemen shall they run. Like the noise of chariots on the top of mountains shall they leap, like the noise of a flame of fire that devour the stubble, as a strong people set in battle array. But it's the idea of the appearance of them, it's already shown as we saw last time, describing the power of Babylon as the power described under the locust banner. The appearance of them is the appearance of horses, and of horsemen shall they run. Now, the appearance of the armies of the Saracens going into battle was obviously a fit description like unto horses, because it was the way that they could use the horse so wonderfully and skillfully in the battle, which was one of the benefits which they derived in being able to defeat the enemy. The cavalry of the Arabs was obviously synonymous with their warfare, and Charles gave us some descriptions last week or last time of the use and the skill of the horsemen of the Arabs, and their victories were very largely attributed to their skill in war on the horseback. It's also interesting that the Italians call the locusts cavalletta. The actual pronunciation by the Italians, or the word they use to describe the locust, is cavalletta, and it literally means a little horse. And therefore, the locust going into battle, as of course when we saw in Thompson's Land in the Book and other places last week, not only do the locusts go in great armies as they devastate the landscape around them, and like a cavalry charge to go, but the actual word which is used describes them as little horses. And that's the description of verse 7, the skill of the Arabs upon the horseback. But their heads, as it were like crowns, like gold. Now you'll notice he doesn't say they wore crowns, but their heads, as it were crowns like gold. And it's generally accepted that what John had actually seen and what he was trying to describe was the fancy headgear which the Arabs wore as they went into battle. And of course it was the turbans, which is very much part of their way of life and their religion. And again, we can go to the history books and they tell us that they were yellow turbans, which they were. They were not real crowns, but as it were, crowns like gold. And of course the yellow imprint, or the yellow impression of gold, was a fit description of the yellow turbans worn by these Arabs. And again, you'll notice in verse 7, their faces were as the faces of men. Now again, we have the contrast in verse 8. They had hair as the hair of women. Now remember, John was writing in the year AD 96, when Rome and Roman culture was the order of the day. And of course, the Romans, as opposed to the Jews, for example, were noted for being clean-shaven, as, with the exception of Colin, so is the English way of life. I suppose it is the exception, even in this country, for a person to be bearded rather than to be clean-shaven. Well, if we go back in Old Testament times, of course, it would be a rare thing to find somebody clean-shaven. It was quite the thing, the norm, the way of life for men to support beards. But when we move into the New Testament, and when the Roman culture came on the scene, it was very much the opposite way. And it was the Romans who were clean-shaven. And of course, to some, that obviously is the face of a woman, because it is natural for a man to grow a beard. I mean, the only reason we can keep our faces, as it were, clean-shaven is because literally every day you have to shave, whereas a woman naturally doesn't have to shave, and yet her face doesn't support a beard. And therefore, going back into the days of creation, a man was created to have the natural instinct to be able to grow a beard, where a woman hadn't. And therefore their faces were as the faces of men. And what John was trying to show was the contrast with the Romans, who were clean-shaven, and these which he saw in vision, which was the faces of men, which was the bearded Arabs. And of course, again, it was very much the case that the Arabs wore beards. But in verse 8, they had hair as the hair of women. Now again, we can go back to a scriptural principle, and we can go back to the 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you want to have a look at it, we'll have a look at it, but I'm sure you all know very much the principle which the Apostle Paul brings out in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Where he says in verse 14, doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But in verse 15, if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. So again, by nature, says Paul, it is normal for a woman to have long hair, but not so for a man. And therefore, for John to see men with long hair he describes the hair as the hair of women. And again, the Arabs were renowned for their flowing tresses or whatever you call it, the long hair which they wore. And of course they sort of whirled it round under their turbans, as they still do today. And of course it is one of the problems which they have come across in this country, where the people who wear the turbans with all the hair underneath obviously have difficulty, for example, in wearing a crash helmet. And there's been many incidents in law when they have been taken to court because they have not been wearing the statutory crash helmet. And it all stemmed back to the things which we are thinking about and considering tonight. And as John saw them, in great contrast to the Romans, once again, which he would be very familiar with, it was unusual for the men to have the long hair. Again, you've seen many pictures of the Caesars of Rome, and not only are they clean-shaven, but they're short-haired. And therefore, in John's day, when he was seeing this vision of the apocalypse, when the revelator was describing these Saracens, these Arabs to him, he describes their hair as being the hair of women. But their teeth, he says, was as the teeth of lions. Their teeth was, as it were, the teeth of lions. And can we go back to the prophecy of Joel again? And in Joel chapter 1, verse 4, just to bring you up to date with the cross quotation, we're describing this Babylonian power: that which the palmer worm hath left, the locust hath eaten; that which the locust hath left, the cankerworm eaten; that which the cankerworm hath left, hath the caterpillar eaten. And then in verse 6 he says, for a nation it is come upon my land, strong and without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he hath the cheek teeth of a great lion. Now, of course, it's describing in Joel chapter 1 the power of Babylon. But like a lion is noted for its obviously ferocity, so here God was describing through the mouth of Joel the great power of Babylon, who's described obviously in the 50th chapter of Jeremiah as a lion. And it was the power of the lion which was indicative here in verse 6, where his teeth were as the teeth of a great lion. And it denotes the power and the ferociousness of the Babylonians. And again, coming back to the 9th chapter of the Apocalypse, that's exactly the idea being conveyed of these Arabs. Their teeth were, as it were, the teeth of lions. They were ferocious. They were powerful, and they had the ability to destroy. And then in verse 9, they had breastplates, as it were, breastplates of iron. And again, the idea here, which is being indicated, is the polished steel breastplates, which of course the Arabs wore as they went into battle. And the sound of their wings, notice, was as the sound of the chariots of many horses. And don't forget, he's describing a locust, which is representative of the power of the Arabs. And the sound of their wings and the noise which the locusts make as they go across the ground was the sound of the chariots of many horses running to battle. And the innumerable number of the cavalry of the Arabs is obviously being indicated here. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Now, I'd like to read you just a quote from Brother Robert Roberts in his book, The 13 Lectures of the Apocalypse, on page 74. And he's speaking about the power which we've described here, where they had tails like unto scorpions. What was the scorpion power possessed by the Saracens? We find an answer in the fact that they employed in their military operations formidable missiles which they styled scorpions. These missiles were of a chemical mixture which was the forerunner of gunpowder. An Arab writer thus speaks of them in 1249. The scorpions, surrounded and ignited by nitrated powder, glide along like serpents with a humming noise, and when exploded they blaze brightly and burn. Now to behold the matter expelled was as a cloud extended through the air, which gave forth a dreadful crash like thunder, vomiting on every side and breaking down, burning and reducing all things to ashes. Armed with this power, known as Saracen fire, and afterward as Greek fire, because finally adopted by the Greeks, the Saracens had power to injure with scorpion power. But their mission was not to extend beyond the affliction of torment. Therefore, Brother Roberts suggests, based upon historical facts again, that what's been described to us here in verse 10 was they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, was this Saracen fire, which they termed as the scorpion, which was the forerunner of gunpowder, which they used for the first time in military campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire. So the first sort of lot of artillery fire, as we understand it in modern warfare, was used by the Arabs in their wars against the Eastern Roman Empire. They had obviously used fire in the past, but this was more than fire. It was exploding like gunpowder. And that's described for us here in verse 10. They had stings in their tails. And then we come to the phrase, at the end of verse 10, their power was to hurt men 5 months. So after describing, which we saw through the history books last time, this great army which had developed under the power of the Muslim faith, we now want to concentrate our minds upon why the Revelator uses these ideas of 5 months. To take you back to verse 5, it was given unto them, this is the Arab power, this is the power which is developed from Mohammed, which was striking and making inroads into the Eastern Roman Empire. It was given unto them that they should not kill them. In other words, it was not going to be the lot of the Arabs to completely destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. It was not given unto them that they should kill them, but they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. It was to be a torment 5 months. And then in verse 10, their power was to hurt men 5 months. So on the first occasion in verse 5, they were to be tormented 5 months. And then in verse 10, they were to hurt them 5 months. So why should there be 2 5-month periods? Why should it exactly say 5 months in verse 5 and 5 months in verse 10? Well, the answer to me seems to be very much, as has been stated previously, that the 5 months is the exact time of locust activity. If you look at the locusts, they are active from May to September. And again, not only Thompson in The Land and the Book, but every authority will tell us that there is a 5-month period for the activity of a locust. And that is normally from May to September. May to September. And therefore, if one was using the symbology of the locust, which of course chapter 9 of the Revelation is, then it's appropriate that 5 months should be used, because as far as the locusts are concerned, that's the only period of time they would be active. And therefore we've got a period in verse 5 represented by 5 months, when the power of the East should be tormented 5 months, And then in verse 10, when that same power should be hurt for 5 months. So we've got 2 periods of 5 months. Now again, we're going to convert the time period into the apocalyptic time scale which we've considered before. Now remember, a month, and we're speaking obviously from a Jewish point of view, is not 30 days or 31 days or 28 days as we've got it in the English calendar, but always a set period of 30 days. And therefore a year, if you recall, from the Jewish point of view, is not 365 days or 365 and a quarter, it's always 360 days. You've always got the 12 months of 30 days. So if you've got 5 months, you've got obviously 150 days, or on the day for the year principle, which again we've considered before, you've got 150 years. So this scorpion power, this low-cost power, which had the sting like a scorpion, I should say, was to inflict terrible pain and terrible hurt and terrible torment upon the Eastern Roman Empire for a period of, in verse 5, 150 years, and then again in verse 10, another 150 years, making 300 years altogether. Now the reason I believe there are 2 5 months and not 1 10 months is on the basis that we have said that it was normal for the activity of a locust to be confined to 5 months. And therefore I believe the revelator, to keep him being with the natural habitat of the locust, is using a period of 5 months. And he's duplicating it to show that the period was not simply 1 5-month period, but was 2 5-month periods. And therefore we've got a period of not 150 years, as a 5-month period would indicate, but 300 years. And do we follow the day for the year and all that? Now again, this is very apt as far as the scriptures and history are concerned. What we've seen in chapter 9 has basically all come about through Mohammed. And if you remember, Mohammed fled from Mecca to Medina in the year 622. It was around about that time that he wrote or had revealed to him, whichever way one likes to put it, the Quran. And it was in the next few years that he was to establish the power, which we have known for many years, as the Muslim power. Now, it was in the year AD 632 that everything was almost established for them to be able to make representation to the power of Constantinople. But of course, it was in that year that friend Mohammed died. And he was succeeded by the first caliph, this man Abu Bakr. And if you remember, for those who were here when we were reading from Gibbon's Rise and Fall, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire last time, it was in that year that the caliph, this Abu Bakr, organised them into a great army. And he began the inroads of making the conquest. And it was very quickly, if you remember, I think it was the year 637, that they were to take Jerusalem and so on and so forth. And therefore, basically, the description of the army of the Arabs has got to be taken from about this year, AD 632, when they were finally established under the faith of the Mohammedans into a great army by the first caliph. So we've put 300 years onto AD 632. We come to the year AD 932. Now, 932 may not mean much to us, but it is quite significant from an historical point of view. Because it was in that year of AD 932 when the Arab power, the Muslim power, began very much to decline. Why? Because the authority and the power was arrested from the Caliph of Baghdad. And it was the Caliph of Baghdad, who obviously was the successor of all the other caliphs who had come from Abu Bakr. And he basically, in that year, lost his power. which was the end of the power of the Saracens, of the Arabs, from a political point of view of having any consequence in the Eastern Roman Empire. Not that they ceased to be. Obviously, we've got many millions of Muslims in the earth today, and they have continued right down the centuries of time. But as far as a power was concerned, they almost ceased to be. Now again, this has its modern counterpart. Although we don't readily appreciate it because none of us were around at that time, prior to 1870, the Roman Catholic Church was very much a political power in this earth. It owned and ruled over many, many parts of Europe. But of course, through the work of Napoleon and others, Rome lost all of its temporal power apart from 1 square mile, which we know as the Vatican City. And although very much as it continued as a religious force, very much as it continued to infiltrate into the affairs of this world, it never has been, since that time, the force that it was prior to the uprise of Napoleon. And so it was, apocalyptically speaking, as far as the Arabs were concerned. They had become the thorn in the flesh as far as the Eastern Roman Empire were concerned. They had caused uprising after uprising and had tormented and hurt the Roman Empire exactly as the first woe trumpet said they would. But in that year AD 932, they ceased to be almost as this power which was to go against the Eastern Roman Empire. And the amazing thing is that Rome continued to be a power. It didn't cease to be. Now again, you might say, well, what's remarkable about that? Well, the answer is quite simple. If you take your mind back to the 8th chapter, in just 4 trumpets, in a very, very short period of time, compared to what we have been considering here under the first woe trumpet, the western part of the Roman Empire fell. In AD 476, Rome ceased to be, as far as the political power in this earth was concerned. In just over 100 years, the barbarian tribes had performed exactly what the Apocalypse said they would do, in causing the western part of Rome to fall. Now, in a much longer period of time, with many more wars stretching over 300 years, the eastern part of the Roman Empire had been afflicted by this Muslim power, and yet it had not been destroyed. It had continued to exist. Although at times, as we have seen, they may have desired to give in, yet it was not in the purpose of God for that to happen. And therefore, under the 5th angel sounding, under this first woe trumpet, we've got the description of the torment and the hurt. But, as verse 5 tells us, to them it was given that they should not kill them. And that's the point we've got to understand. It was never the intention of the Almighty for Mohammed and the Mohammedan power to destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. That was to be left to another, which is coming under the second woe trumpet. It was never in the purpose of the Almighty for the Arabs to destroy Eastern Rome. Now that in itself, to me, is amazing. Because again, one could assume by natural sort of means that if you'd got a greater power, he would eventually destroy and overrun a weaker power. And yet God, in chapter 8, has shown us that by the barbarian tribes, Rome was to fall. But now in chapter 9, over a period of 300 years, the Muslim was to attack and to eat away at the Roman Empire, but not to destroy it. And that takes us back to history again from the Old Testament. It sometimes was in the purpose of God for nations to be completely overrun and ruled over by an opposing power. Sometimes, as we have seen with Edom, It was necessary in the purpose of God for that power to cease to be altogether. We think of Babylon, and we think of the way in Isaiah chapter 13 God declared that there would cease to be as a nation in the earth. And yet in Ezekiel chapter 29, when speaking of Egypt, he said Egypt would be run over by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians for 40 years would completely decimate the land of Egypt. But it would continue. And he said that Egypt would remain a nation right the way through the ages of time. But he says it would be no more than a base nation. It would be no more than a base nation. And of course, one of the greatest signs that we've got in the world today, as far as the fulfillment of the purpose of God is concerned, is that Egypt exactly what God said it would be. And where's Babylon? Gone forever, as God said it would be. Where's Edom? Gone forever, as God said it would be. So some nations are allowed to exist. Other nations are completely cut off. And it's all being controlled by the angels who perform God's will. And therefore, under this fifth trumpet, the first woe trumpet, the point we've got to bear in mind and to understand is that while it was describing for us the uprising of Mohammed and the uprising of the Muslim power, and they were to afflict and torment the Eastern Roman Empire, they were not to destroy it. It was to remain in existence until the second woe trumpet was pronounced upon it. So we come to verse 11. Verse 11 says, "And they had a king over them." They had a king over them. Now, for those who weren't here last time, I do think it's worth going back to the book of Proverbs and chapter 30. Because in the wisdom of Solomon, there's a superb verse in Proverbs chapter 30 concerning the locusts. In Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 27, as we saw last time, the locusts have no king, yet go they forth all of them by bands. And that's one of the unique things about the locusts. They don't seem to have a leader. And we contrasted them with the bees. And of course the bee do have the queen as their leader. But the locusts don't seem to have anybody who's in control. And yet they all go together, and they all work together, and they all destroy together. Now, the Jerusalem Bible, and I'm going to quote from the Jerusalem again, for no other reason that I'm trying to be consistent to the various translations which can be used. The 9th chapter and verse 11 reads like this: "As their leader, they had their emperor, the angel of the abyss, whose name in the Hebrew is Abaddon, or Apollyon in the Greek." So where we've got here in the authorized version, they had a king over them, the Jerusalem Bible says they had as their leader, they had an emperor. Now, what's so remarkable about this? Well, again, we discussed last week, it's not in the nature of the Arabs, basically, to submit to single authority. But they did under Mohammed. He managed to weld together the whole of the Arabs under one cause, that of Islam, the Quran, the Muslim faith. And it was out of context with the very nature of these people. For generations upon generations, they'd never had one combining influence, and yet now they were. And they submitted to the authority of Mohammed. And not only that, to his successors, the caliphs. And of course that's precisely what we've got here in verse 11. The caliphs is their leader, the one, the king who ruled over them. And he is the angel of the bottomless pit. Now again, you will notice we've got in verses 1 and 2 the key of the bottomless pit, and then in verse 2 he opened the bottomless pit. And we laid great stress that the actual phrase should be the shaft of the bottomless pit, or the shaft of the abyss, and not the abyss itself. Although the phrase the bottomless pit is used in verses 1 and 2, the phrase in the Greek relates to the shaft. But that's not the case here in verse 11. The phrase, the bottomless pit, is exactly what we have got translated in other parts of the Apocalypse. It simply means the abyss. It's nothing to do with the shaft now. It's the abyss. And therefore they had a king over them, which is the messenger of the abyss. And the abyss, obviously, as we've seen in previous studies, was referring to the Roman Empire at that time, the Eastern Roman Empire. And it was the caliphs who was the messenger of the abyss at that time, because he was the one who was performing the will and the purpose of God. But you'll notice, he's been given a name. And his name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, or in the Greek tongue, Apollyon. Now I want to take you back to the Gospel of John, chapter 19. I want us to recall the way the inscription was written over the cross of Jesus. You remember in verse 19 of John 19, Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title then read, Many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. And it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. Now it was not coincidental that it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. It was because it was the languages of all people of the day. It was either Hebrew, Greek or Latin. And therefore it was written in a language which anybody could have understood. Now if you come back to the Apocalypse in chapter 9, we are given the name of this man in the Hebrew. We are given his name in the Greek, but we are not given his name in the Latin. Why? Well, of course, if again you think about it, and you think about the outline of the Roman world as we know it from the New Testament days, the Hebrew obviously relates to the land of Israel and the environments of it. The Greek obviously was to stretch in Asia Minor, as we noticed, the east part of the Roman Empire, where Latin, of course, was from Rome. And it was the western part of the Roman Empire which was very much Latin orientated. And still, very much, Catholicism is based on Latin even to this day. The 9th chapter of the Apocalypse has got nothing to do with the western part of the Roman Empire. It's to do with the East and the area of the Middle East. We find that the Arabs came up, obviously, out of the area of Medina, the Saudi Arabia as we know it today, and spread throughout the Middle East. And one of the first conquests that it made, as we saw last time, was Jerusalem and the land of Israel. One of the first inroads into the Eastern Roman Empire was made at Jerusalem. And therefore, first, his name is described in the Hebrew tongue, Abaddon, and it literally means destroyer. That's what the word means, a destroyer. And it was Israel who first felt the truth of that name, a destroyer. Because as the Mohammedan faith spread out, it was the city of Jerusalem and the land of Israel which first came under the domination of this power. But then, as it spread, and it began to dominate more of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, it obviously infiltrated into the areas where the Greek tongue was obviously in the ascendancy. And in the Greek tongue, you'll notice, his name was Apollyon. And you'll notice, in the margin, that is to say, a destroyer. Same word. One in the Hebrew, the other in the Greek. Exactly the same meaning. A destroyer. And that's exactly what they were. A destroying force. Now, I feel again, it shows to us the remarkable accuracy of the Scriptures. That it was to do with the Middle East, with the land of Israel and the Greek Catholic countries, not to do with the Eastern Latin areas of Rome. And therefore he is described as a destroyer in the Hebrew and the Greek tongue. And therefore in verse 12, one woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter. Now, we haven't got time, have we? No. Right, what we want to do next time then, God willing, as I said, and the reason for all these books, is I wanted to just bring together in one sort of cameo the whole of the history of this Muslim power, so that we can, in some very brief, short sentences, give you the overall history. And then secondly, I want us to think about the uprise of Mohammedanism as it affects us today, and the place which the Muslims have in the world today, and the way it is affecting the purpose of God being fulfilled. And I was just going to quote you a few things, but we'll leave that for next time.